Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, her hands moving in practiced circles as she watched the steam rise from the industrial coffee machine. The Naval War College cafeteria buzzed with its usual morning energy, officers in crisp uniforms discussing strategy over breakfast, their voices creating a low hum that had become the soundtrack of her workdays. She had been working at the cafeteria for 8 months now, ever since she moved to Newport to be closer to her aging mother. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her health insurance. Most days, she felt invisible among the decorated military personnel who passed through her line. Their minds focused on matters of national security, while she focused on keeping their coffee cups full. Sarah had her own military history, though she rarely spoke about it. 10 years ago, she had been Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a communications specialist in the Navy. She had served on 3 different ships, earned commendations for her work, and had been on track for a promising career. But life had other plans. Her father's sudden death and her mother's declining health had forced her to make the difficult decision to leave active duty and return home to California. The transition to civilian life had been harder than she expected. The structure, the purpose, the sense of belonging she had felt in the Navy was replaced by a series of dead-end jobs and the constant worry about her mother's medical bills. When her mother needed specialized care that was only available on the East Coast, Sarah had packed up their lives and moved across the country, taking whatever work she could find. Now, as she served coffee to active duty officers every day, she sometimes felt like she was watching her old life from the outside. These men and women spoke the language she once spoke fluently, discussed operations and protocols she understood completely, but she remained silent, pouring coffee and clearing tables while her past remained locked away. The morning rush was particularly busy today. Word had spread that Admiral Rebecca Hayes would be visiting the War College for a special briefing on Pacific Fleet operations. Admiral Hayes was a legend in the Navy, one of the first women to command a carrier strike group, and now serving as a key advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sarah had heard the younger officers talking about her with a mixture of awe and nervousness. As Sarah refilled the coffee dispensers, she caught fragments of conversations about the Admiral's visit. Some officers mentioned her reputation for being tough but fair. Others spoke of her innovative strategies that had revolutionized naval communications during her command. Sarah found herself listening more intently than usual, remembering the days when such discussions would have included her voice. The morning wore on, and Sarah noticed an unusual tension in the air. Officers were checking their uniforms more carefully, conversations were more subdued, and there was an overall sense of anticipation that reminded her of pre-inspection mornings during her service years. She understood the feeling well, the desire to make a good impression on someone whose career you admired, whose approval could change your trajectory. Around 10:30, a group of senior officers entered the cafeteria, their conversation more animated than usual. Sarah overheard them discussing the timing of the Admiral's arrival and the agenda for her briefings. They spoke of new communication protocols, advanced satellite systems, and strategic partnerships that would shape the Navy's future. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to be part of those conversations again, to contribute her expertise and feel the satisfaction of meaningful work. She shook off the thought and returned to her tasks. Those days were behind her now, and dwelling on what might have been served no purpose. Her mother needed her, and that was what mattered. She had made her choice, and she had made peace with it, even if some mornings like this one stirred up old longings. As the clock approached 11, the cafeteria began to empty as officers headed to their various duties and briefings. Sarah started her usual mid-morning cleaning routine, wiping down tables and restocking supplies. The relative quiet after the morning rush always gave her time to think, sometimes too much time. She was arranging napkins in their dispensers when she heard footsteps approaching from the main corridor. The sound was different from the usual foot traffic, more purposeful, accompanied by the kind of respectful murmur that indicated someone important was approaching. Sarah glanced up briefly, then returned to her work, not wanting to appear to be gawking at whoever was commanding such attention. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could hear a woman's voice, clear and confident, discussing logistics with what sounded like several aides. The voice had the unmistakable tone of command, the kind that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars of equipment. Sarah had heard that tone before, had even used it herself in her previous life, though never with quite the same level of authority. She continued her work, conscious that important people were nearby, but determined to remain professional and unobtrusive. In her months at the cafeteria, she had learned that the best approach was to be efficient and invisible, to let the officers conduct their business without drawing attention to herself. It was a survival strategy that had served her well, keeping her job secure and her supervisors satisfied. The voices grew closer, and Sarah realized that the group was entering the cafeteria area. She kept her head down, focusing on her tasks, but she could feel the presence of several people nearby. The conversation continued, touching on topics that were both familiar and foreign to her. Familiar because she understood the terminology and concepts, foreign because she was no longer part of that world. As she moved to wipe down the coffee station, Sarah became aware that the group had approached the service area. She could see military dress shoes and the hem of what appeared to be a naval officer's uniform in her peripheral vision. The conversation had paused, and there was a moment of quiet that felt heavy with expectation. Sarah straightened up slowly, professionally, ready to offer coffee service to whoever had approached her station. As she lifted her head, she found herself looking directly into the face of Admiral Rebecca Hayes. The Admiral was shorter than Sarah had expected from the photos she had seen in Navy publications, but her presence filled the space around her with an unmistakable authority. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation style, and her uniform bore the ribbons and insignia of a distinguished career spanning decades. For a moment, Sarah felt time slow down. She was looking at one of the most respected officers in the modern Navy, someone whose career trajectory represented everything Sarah had once hoped to achieve. The Admiral's eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking in everything around her with the kind of attention to detail that separated good officers from great ones. "Good morning," Admiral Hayes said, her voice carrying the same commanding presence that Sarah had heard from the corridor. "I understand you serve excellent coffee here." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, falling naturally into the respectful tone she had learned during her own service years. "What can I get for you?" "Just black coffee, please," the Admiral said, then turned slightly to address her aides. "We have about 15 minutes before the next briefing. Why don't you gentlemen review those deployment schedules we discussed earlier?" As Sarah moved to pour the coffee, she was acutely aware of the Admiral's presence. There was something about being in close proximity to such high-ranking leadership that reminded her of everything she had loved about military service, the sense of purpose, the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, the pride that came with wearing the uniform. She handed the Admiral her coffee, careful to maintain the proper level of professional courtesy without overstepping any boundaries. Admiral Hayes accepted the cup with a brief nod of thanks, then seemed to study Sarah's face more carefully than was typical for such an interaction. "Have we met before?" the Admiral asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "There's something familiar about you." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. It was possible that their paths had crossed during her active duty years, though she couldn't recall any direct interaction with someone of Admiral Hayes's rank. "I don't believe so, ma'am," she said carefully. The Admiral continued to study her face, and Sarah could practically see the mental filing system at work behind those sharp eyes. It was the look of someone accustomed to remembering faces, names, and details that might prove important later. Sarah had seen the same expression on the faces of other senior officers during her service years. The ability to catalog and retrieve information about personnel was crucial in military leadership. "Your bearing," Admiral Hayes said thoughtfully. "You carry yourself like military. Current service?" "Former service, ma'am," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the unexpected turn in the conversation. She hadn't anticipated being questioned about her background during what should have been a routine coffee service interaction. The Admiral nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "What was your specialty?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, aware that the Admiral's aides were now paying attention to their conversation. She had become accustomed to her military background being irrelevant to her current job, and the sudden focus on her past felt both welcome and uncomfortable. "Communications, ma'am. I was a lieutenant." "Communications," Admiral Hayes repeated, her interest clearly piqued. "What ships?" "USS Hampton, USS Columbia, and USS Albany, ma'am." The Admiral's eyebrows rose slightly, and Sarah saw a look of recognition beginning to form on her face. The ships Sarah had mentioned were all nuclear submarines, and communications personnel on those vessels represented some of the most highly trained technicians in the Navy. It was specialized work that required extensive security clearances and demonstrated competence under extreme conditions. "Albany," Admiral Hayes said, her voice taking on a different tone. "You were on Albany during the Bering Sea operation." It wasn't a question, and Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized where the conversation was heading. The Bering Sea operation had been classified at the highest levels, involving communications intercepts and intelligence gathering in extremely sensitive waters. Sarah's role had been crucial to the mission's success, but it wasn't something she could discuss, even with someone of Admiral Hayes's clearance level. "I cannot discuss operational details, ma'am," Sarah said, falling back on the response that had been drilled into her during her security briefings years ago. "Of course not," Admiral Hayes said, but there was a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But you were the communications specialist who maintained contact through that storm system, the one who improvised the relay solution when the primary satellites went down." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Admiral wasn't just fishing for information. She clearly knew specific details about Sarah's service record and her performance during one of the most challenging missions of her career. The storm system Admiral Hayes referenced had been unlike anything Sarah had experienced before or since, with weather conditions that had knocked out their primary communication systems at a critical moment in the operation. The improvised solution had required Sarah to work for 18 straight hours, recalibrating equipment and establishing alternative communication paths using a combination of different satellite networks and emergency frequencies. It had been the kind of performance that earned commendations and recommendations for advancement, but it had also been highly classified work that shouldn't be discussed in a public setting. "I remember reviewing the after-action reports," Admiral Hayes continued, her voice lower now, clearly aware of the sensitive nature of the topic. "Outstanding work under impossible conditions. Your commanding officer recommended you for advancement to lieutenant commander." Sarah nodded silently, remembering the pride she had felt when Captain Morrison had told her about the recommendation. It should have been the beginning of an accelerated career path, the kind of recognition that opened doors and created opportunities. Instead, it had come just weeks before her father's death and the beginning of the family crisis that would ultimately end her Navy career. "What happened to that recommendation?" Admiral Hayes asked gently. "Family circumstances required me to leave active duty, ma'am," Sarah said, the standard explanation she had given so many times it felt automatic. The Admiral studied her face again, and Sarah could see understanding and perhaps a touch of sympathy in her expression. Admiral Hayes had been in the Navy long enough to know that talented officers sometimes faced impossible choices between their careers and their personal responsibilities. She had probably seen promising careers ended by everything from family crises to health problems to simple bad luck. "And now you're here," Admiral Hayes said, gesturing slightly to indicate the cafeteria around them. "Yes, ma'am. It's honest work, and it allows me to care for my mother." Admiral Hayes nodded, but Sarah could see that her mind was working through something more complex than simple acknowledgement. The Admiral's aides were checking their watches, clearly aware that their schedule was tight, but Admiral Hayes seemed in no hurry to end the conversation. Admiral Hayes took a sip of her coffee, seemingly lost in thought for a moment. When she looked back at Sarah, there was a decisiveness in her expression that suggested she had reached some kind of conclusion. "Sparrow," Admiral Hayes said suddenly, her voice carrying across the now quiet cafeteria. Sarah felt as if the world had suddenly shifted around her. Sparrow had been her call sign during her service on the Albany, a nickname earned during her first week aboard, when she had somehow managed to maintain communications during a particularly difficult exercise, while most of the more experienced technicians had struggled. The captain had said she was quick and clever like a sparrow, and the name had stuck throughout her deployment. It had been years since anyone had called her by that name. In her current life, she was simply Sarah, the woman who served coffee and cleaned tables. Her military identity had become something private, almost secret, a part of her past that she rarely discussed and never celebrated. Hearing her old call sign spoken aloud felt like hearing her real name for the first time in years. The effect on the room was immediate and electric. Every conversation stopped. Officers who had been discussing routine matters suddenly turned their attention to the interaction taking place at the coffee station. The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Sarah stood frozen, the coffee pot still in her hand, looking directly at Admiral Hayes. The Admiral's use of her call sign had been deliberate, calculated to produce exactly this reaction. But why? What purpose did it serve to reveal Sarah's military background to a room full of active-duty officers? "Admiral," one of the aides said quietly, clearly confused by the sudden change in the conversation's direction. Admiral Hayes held up a hand to silence her aide, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Tell me, Sparrow, are you familiar with the new integrated communications protocols we've been implementing across the Pacific Fleet?" The question caught Sarah off guard. The new protocols Admiral Hayes referenced were cutting-edge developments that had only been theoretical concepts during Sarah's active duty years. She had read about them in technical journals she still subscribed to, maintaining her interest in the field even though she was no longer part of it. "I've read about them in the technical literature, ma'am," Sarah said carefully. "The concept of using AI-assisted frequency management to optimize satellite communications across multiple platforms." "And what did you think of the approach?" Admiral Hayes asked, her tone suggesting this was more than casual curiosity. Sarah hesitated. She was acutely aware that every person in the cafeteria was listening to their conversation, but Admiral Hayes seemed to expect a substantive answer. "The theoretical framework is sound, ma'am, but I suspect the implementation challenges are significant. The processing power required for real-time optimization across multiple satellite networks would be enormous, and the potential for system failures could create communication gaps at critical moments." A slight smile crossed Admiral Hayes's face. "Go on." "Well, ma'am, from what I've read, the system relies heavily on predictive algorithms to anticipate communication needs. But maritime operations are inherently unpredictable. Weather, electronic warfare, equipment failures, any of these could render the predictions inaccurate and leave commanders without reliable communications when they need them most." The silence in the room had taken on a different quality now. Sarah could sense that the officers around her were no longer just curious about the unusual conversation. They were impressed by her technical knowledge and analytical thinking. She was demonstrating expertise that clearly exceeded what anyone would expect from a cafeteria worker. "You've identified the exact concerns my technical staff raised," Admiral Hayes said. "What would you recommend?" Sarah felt as though she was in a dream. Here she was, discussing advanced naval communications technology with one of the most senior officers in the Navy, while wearing a cafeteria uniform and holding a coffee pot. The surreal nature of the situation was not lost on her, but her professional instincts were taking over. "Hybrid systems, ma'am. Maintain the AI optimization for routine communications, but build in robust manual override capabilities and redundant pathways that don't rely on the predictive algorithms. Train communication specialists to seamlessly transition between automated and manual control based on operational conditions." Admiral Hayes nodded slowly, and Sarah could see approval in her expression. "That's essentially what we've concluded as well. The question is finding personnel with both the technical expertise to manage the AI systems and the operational experience to know when and how to override them." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah understood that Admiral Hayes was not just testing her knowledge, she was evaluating her potential contribution to solving a real problem facing the Navy. But that seemed impossible. Sarah was no longer part of that world, no longer eligible for the kind of positions that would allow her to work on such projects. "Ma'am," one of the aides interjected gently, "we really do need to move to the next briefing." Admiral Hayes glanced at her watch, then back at Sarah. "Indeed we do." She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a business card, which she placed on the counter next to Sarah's coffee station. "Sparrow, I want you to think about what we've discussed today. Really think about it." Sarah looked down at the card, which bore the Admiral's name, title, and contact information, along with the seal of the Office of Naval Operations. It was the kind of card that opened doors and created opportunities, the kind of card she would have treasured during her active duty years. "I don't understand, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "The Navy is facing complex challenges that require innovative solutions," Admiral Hayes said. "We need people who understand both the technology and the operational realities, people who can bridge the gap between theoretical possibilities and practical applications. Your experience, your knowledge, your perspective, these are valuable assets." Sarah felt her heart racing. Was Admiral Hayes suggesting what she thought she was suggesting? The possibility seemed too good to be true, too much like the kind of second chance that only happened in movies. "But ma'am, I'm no longer active duty. I don't have current clearances. I haven't kept up with all the latest developments." "These are all solvable problems," Admiral Hayes said firmly. "The question is whether you're interested in solving them." The Admiral gathered her things and prepared to leave, but she paused for one final comment. "The Navy invested considerable resources in your training, Sparrow. Your country invested in your development as a communications specialist. That investment doesn't disappear just because circumstances forced you to step away for a while." Admiral Hayes and her aides moved toward the exit, but the Admiral stopped and turned back one more time. "Call me within the week. We'll discuss opportunities that might allow you to serve your country again while meeting your family obligations." And then she was gone, leaving Sarah standing behind the coffee station with a business card in her hand and a room full of officers staring at her with newfound respect. The silence stretched for several moments before conversations gradually resumed, but Sarah could feel that something fundamental had changed. She looked down at the Admiral's business card, then around the cafeteria where she had worked anonymously for 8 months. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where her skills and experience could matter again, where she could contribute to something larger than herself while still fulfilling her responsibilities to her mother. The coffee pot was still warm in her other hand, grounding her in the reality of her current situation. But Admiral Hayes's words echoed in her mind. "Call me within the week." It was an invitation back to the world she had never really wanted to leave, an opportunity to reclaim the identity that had been buried under years of practical compromises and necessary sacrifices. Sarah carefully placed the Admiral's card in her uniform pocket, next to her heart, and returned to her duties. But everything was different now. The officers who passed through her line looked at her with curiosity and respect. Her supervisor, who had witnessed the entire exchange, treated her with newfound deference. And most importantly, Sarah felt something stirring inside herself that she hadn't felt in years, hope for a future that honored both her capabilities and her commitments. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about satellites and frequencies, about storm systems and emergency protocols, about the satisfaction of solving complex technical problems under pressure. She thought about her mother, too, and the care she would continue to need. But for the first time since leaving the Navy, Sarah began to believe that maybe she didn't have to choose between serving her country and serving her family. The Admiral's call sign for her, Sparrow, continued to echo in her mind throughout the day. It was more than just a nickname. It was recognition of who she had been and, perhaps, who she could be again. As she cleaned the coffee station one final time before her shift ended, Sarah made her decision. She would call Admiral Hayes. She would explore the possibilities. She would see if there was a way to spread her wings again, while keeping her feet firmly planted in the responsibilities that mattered most. The business card felt like a key in her pocket, a key to a door she had thought was permanently closed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah Martinez, call sign Sparrow, would go to sleep knowing that her story was far from over.